Hi, welcome back to the Busy Corner. This is lesson 19. Today I'm going to show you how to make a slouchy beanie like the one I'm wearing. And don't be scared, this just isn't a good look for me. Now, I have kind of a small head. I cast on 30 stitches and I only knit my body about 6 inches long. Let me turn around so you see the back. And it's in seed stitch except for the decreasing portion. Here is another version of it. I didn't do a color change when I was finished with the ribbing, and of course this is quite a bit larger. This is my first experiment. I put on 36 stitches. So, but you can see by making the body slightly longer, if you have a larger head, you'll want the body about 7 inches, and I'll put, of course, all the pattern directions in my description. You can make it as slouchy as you want. You don't have to do a color change if you don't want to. So, in order to make this beanie, and again, I made mine smaller because that looked really goofy on me, but, so this would fit probably a teenager or a small adult head, and I did it in Woolies yarn. The ribbing is done in, I think it's called Sequoia, and the body I did in Snapdragon. And in order to make this hat, you will need to know 3 stitches. You'll need to know, well, your front stitch and back stitch, so you could do the ribbing around the edge, and you're going to do that for 5 rows. You will need to be able to do your seed stitch for the body, and then instead of doing a complicated pattern for this decrease, I just changed to garter stitch because it looks so similar, and you'll never notice that difference. So, in order to make it, if you want to do a color change, you'll need about 20 yards for the edge and approximately 40 yards for the body, depending on how big you want it to be. Otherwise, figure about 60 yards. So, even one of the modeled colors of Woolies will be plenty for a hat. It took me less than 2 hours. I did this 5 times to make sure the pattern was going to work out for different sizes, and they made it in as little as an hour and 45 minutes, so it's a quick project. Now, you will need your knitting hoop, of course, and I actually have one in progress here. I'm making another one for myself. So you can see I have on here, I believe it's 37 stitches, because I've already done my increase. This is a 10-inch hoop. I wanted to see, how many stitches I could cram on there, and I could actually hold more. So you'll see when I do the decrease that the smaller the hoop you can get away with, the better. I still think the 11-inch is a very flexible size, but in order to make the hat as I did, you will also need to make yourself a tiny hoop. Now, I did not like knitting on this for a whole hat because I tried it. But what I did was I bought some other tubing, and this is it's the polyethylene ice maker tubing. But this is 3/8 inch on the outside, 1/4 inch on the inside, and it is quite small. You're going to still put your wire in here. I made mine 10 inches long, and then I had to plug it with glue because I didn't have wood plugs that would fit in there. So, but you'll see when we start that this is very tiny to work with. So you'll need if you want to do it this way, I think it looks better to do the ribbed edge with the smaller hoop because it's tighter, you can see. And this, this is fairly open. You could probably use heavier yarn, but the heavier yarn you work with, the harder it's going to be to work through your stitches. So anyway, and so you will need your 2 sizes of hoops if you want to make yourself another one, and your row counter, of course, a tape measure, and a couple of these little stitch markers. So anyway, this is one in progress on a 10-inch hoop, but for most people, most adults, you'll probably want to use your 11-inch hoop. So we're going to set this aside a moment. This video will probably be in 2 parts. I want to take you through all the different steps of this. First, you need to cast on, and let's assume, by the way, I don't really like this color combination. I've just chosen this because I thought it'd be easy to see. Dark colors don't show up very well on these knitting videos I found. But anyway, so we'll start with this blue, and to cast on you will need approximately 4 to 5 feet, depending on how many stitches you're going to cast on. So if you want to go from the tip of your finger to just past your shoulder, that's about 4 feet. And we'll put on 30, in fact I want to do 34 stitches because there's a weird number that works out in the decrease and I want to show you that. So assume that you needed 34 stitches. So as always, you're going to take your tail, is going to be on your left, this is your working on your right, and I just cross these two over to make a figure 8 and have my fingers through, grab my working yarn and pull it through. I think to me that's the easiest way of doing a slip knot, and put it on your little mini hoop. And as before, you're going to take your the tail and put it around your thumb, and the working yarn goes around your forefinger. You will grasp them and hold them against your palm, and you will snug this up first. You don't want these too tight, you want them to move, but you want them snug enough. This is your, this is your ribbing, so you want it to fit snugly on your head. And take now that side of your teardrop and come underneath this first yarn coming around your thumb. Come around the piece that's going over your forefinger. Now bring this back over. Take your working yarn now and snug that up. Not so tight that it can't be moved, but you want to be consistent. So again, you're just taking that tip, coming under the tail, under the working yarn, and then bringing this back over, which creates the loop. And each time, take your working yarn and snug that a little bit so they look consistent. They're not going to be perfect, but you want them to be the same. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. You can see I'm kind of moving my hand and the hoop. Every time I talk though, I lose count. There's 4, 8, 9, 10, 11. There's 12, 13. Oops. That's what happens when I go fast. If you've ever made a video, you know how weird, all of a sudden you can't do it anymore as soon as the camera gets turned on. Okay, we're going to pause it. I'm going to finish casting on, then we'll start knitting. Hi, we're back. I've cast on 34 stitches onto the mini rod. I just put the last one on. And now to begin knitting, and you can see they're pretty even, and that's how you'd want it to look. Otherwise that, won't look very nice at the edge. So now you're going to turn your hoop over, and you're going to rotate this ridge inside. And you want to make sure, just like as in circular knitting, you want to make sure that this stays straight for your first couple rows. If you twist them when you knit them, it won't turn out. So now you've done this, now put it in your hoop holder, whatever you've made for yourself. And if your hoop holder is, if you find there's a little too much room, stick in the edge of one of these sticky mats. So stick that in there, because this hoop is smaller, remember. And put on your stitch marker. So, to knit your first 2 stitches, this is your ribbing. I put on an even number of stitches, and I did that so that my ribbing would look nice if I did front 1, back 1, front 1, back 1. That way you won't have 2 fronts or backs lined up together. So, I always start with a front stitch, and for your first 2 stitches, I think it looks nicer if you go ahead and use your tail and your working yarn together at the same time. If you hear rushing, by the way, in the background, that's the wind. My craft room is up in our attic, and it's like 100 degrees up here unless we open the windows. So today, it's very windy. All this humidity's getting out of here. So, I'd rather have the wind, so I hope you don't mind. So, now we're going to start with the front stitch. And these are very tiny, so you have a couple of options. You can take it off and put your finger through it. Take these 2 pieces of yarn, and again, you have your working yarn and your tail, and press them against your forefinger and press these two pieces of yarn between your forefingers. Now push with your right one and it'll take these two yarns and bring them right through for you and pipe them. And remember, when you make a front stitch, now you can see the yarn is coming from the hoop, it's making the new loop, and now you want to put it on just like that. So there's your first stitch. And by the way, I made this with brass wire and they want to unbend sometimes. I would use steel. If you find you need your hoop a little tighter, just bend it. It'll be fine. Alright, so there's my first front stitch. Now I'm going to take this off. I like to take my yarn and put it back here. You don't have to. You can even drop it. Take your stitch off. Now remember, you're going in through the back, or you can think of it as moving left to right through the stitch. But do the same thing you just did. Put your finger through there. These are tiny holes, and this will help. Now take your yarn and press it against your other forefinger and push it through. Now your stitch is coming this way. Now pipe it, just like that. Tighten it. Now this tail could just stick back through there. You've done a front stitch and a back stitch, and now you do another front stitch. Now I will point out, these stitches, these rows in which you are changing to a new stitch pattern are critical because there's nothing to use as reference. But after we go along here a bit, I'm going to show you something so that you don't have to recount every time. Now, so that time I had a little trouble getting through. Again, these are very tiny. I don't think you'd want to do this with hoops that were any smaller. And as I said, I tried to do a whole hat on this tiny hoop, and I wanted to throw it out the window. So I'm not saying it's a good idea to do a whole hat this way. Now I've lost count, see, because I'm doing the video. So there's two things you can do. So here's my stitch marker. I know this was a front stitch, a back stitch, a front stitch, and a back stitch. Now, while we're on that topic though, look at something here. Here was your first front stitch. Here was your first back stitch. You notice how the yarn, the previous stitch, angles to the left and up and back, and I know that was a back stitch. I know this was a front stitch, and I know this was a back stitch. So rather than going through and counting your whole hoop to see where you are, if you've done them correctly, you should see your back stitches. And they should go up and to the back, and that's a good reference. So now I do a front stitch. And again, this is tricky. I had much better luck using the Woolies yarn for these hats than I did the Hometown USA, because these plies of this Woolies, they want to stay together. They don't want to separate. And on this smaller pipe, you need it that way. Now, and again, this seems very tedious, and you're probably saying to yourself, boy, this is kind of a stupid craft. And I'd almost agree with you if I was only making it on these little, but you'll get used to it, and I'm slowing down for the purpose of the camera. But I will also say I've made almost 6 hats now in just a couple of days, and my hands don't hurt too bad. I've got a little pain right here in my thumb. So to me, that tells me this is a good technique for myself and for people who have any kind of, you know, difficulty with their hands. This is much easier to do than holding knitting needles, in my opinion. Alright, so there, I lost track again where I was at. I'm not even sure. That looks funny. I think that was a front stitch, that was my back stitch. Let's make sure. Front, back, front, back, front, back, front, back, front. Alright, that's right. So sometimes you still have to count if you're not sure. You know, the stitch doesn't look quite right. So you're going to continue around this hat, and we will take another short break. Okay, we're back. I only have, this is my first round, and I should have clicked my clicker to tell me that. But anyway, I have 2 stitches remaining to finish the round, And you can see if I separate this, it's easier to tell the back stitches from the front stitches. So here was a front, here was a back, a front, a back, and you should have two left that's a front and a back if you started with an even number and you started with a front stitch. If you don't, something's wrong. So you can see how long it is already, and you can begin to push it through there. And you know, after you've done the first round, it won't twist over on itself. You have 2 stitches left to make, and again, I snug these up pretty firmly, and as this is your ribbing and you want it to stay taut. So now there's my last stitch. Now you have to remember, when you begin round 2, move your stitch marker over first of all. Remember that those first 2 stitches had 2 loops of yarn. So when you take this stitch off, if you only take one, and it doesn't matter which, but if you only took one of these and tried to knit it, let's separate it for just a moment, then you're going to find that this is not really coming away. You might try to knit it anyway, and when you try to knit the second one, you're going to wonder why you have 2 front stitches in a row. That's because you've goofed. You need to take both of them off together. And I say you have 2 choices. Those, again, have to be front stitches. And you also know, you can start to see already the little V, and you know that's a front stitch. So you can either take them off at the same time and put your yarn through. There's one way to make the stitch. Or, and again, I like to put the yarn behind. That helps me as I'm moving my stitches around too. I can say to myself, oh yes, that needs to be a back stitch. The other way you can do it is to take off, you know, if you were especially knitting 2 together, take off one at a time so that you could more easily get your finger. And remember that, you know, the back stitch is always through, you can think of it as the top or left to right. And you just continue on. Now I've done my 2 double stitches. I know that's a front stitch because here my little bow tie sign is underneath. So I need to go, you can think of it as under the stitch. If you have trouble manipulating your wrists, you might want to take your stitches off like this and move them this way. Notice I'm not turning my wrist as much. And I mention that because I know there's people out there who have a little difficulty with their wrists. Again, you could drop that stitch to make your back stitch. Again, here's your bow tie sign. And you could hold it like this and push your yarn from left to right. It doesn't matter, just as long as you know what to say to yourself, and as long as you always put the stitch on correctly. And when you're moving your yarn around, you might want to hold it up here at the tip. I think you get the idea. So I'm going to continue knitting. When we come back, we will be at the 5th round where we have to do a yarn over to increase for the body of our hat.